Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to Rock Your WinForms Apps with DevExpress MVVM presented by DevExpress Technical Evangelist Don Wibier. In today's session, though WPF is designed with MVVM in mind, Don will show you how you can apply this to your WinForms applications. He'll introduce you to a really cool framework which ships with our WinForms controls, plus watch him build a small application to give you an impression of the power behind this framework. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Don.
Thanks, Amanda, and welcome everybody. In this webinar, I'm going to introduce you with the core principles of MVVM and the framework Amanda mentioned. It will enable you to implement this MVVM design pattern. And to give you a quick start on what we're going to do, let me first explain what is MVVM and why. Well, it stands for Model View Model, and it is a design pattern which enforces a couple of things in your application architecture to make your application more maintainable by separating the UI from data persistence through the view model. By following this approach, things could be changed in the data layer without the need to update all views in your application. Another advantage is that your model may contain all the data you need. This might not be the most optimal way of presenting it on the UI. So the view model will take care of transforming the data to the most optimal structure for presentation. So by preparing everything in the view model, the UI can use data binding on the view model, which is one of the core features which we find in, for instance, WPF. When using this design pattern, we get a really nice feature with it as well. But first, let's go through this small overview. So we have the model, we have the view, and we have the view model in between. And what you can see clearly here, that there is like a separation between the view and the model, so there is no direct communication. This is all being done by the view model. We have two-way binding between the view and the view model, and we also have a couple of other things like commands. For instance, if we press a button on the UI, we need to invoke some process on the view model, and that is done through commands. And last, we have something which is called notifications. So in case something changes either in the data or on the UI, that should be synchronized all across, and you'll see a bit later how that works. The interesting thing is that if you take a look at the model, it can be anything. It can be Entity Framework, it can be our own object relational mapping tool, persistent objects, it can even be SQL commands with stored procedures, etc., or even web services, and obviously a combination of all. The view model and the view do not really care about how that model is constructed. Well, I was talking about this other feature that we get for free when implementing the MVVM design pattern, and that is that we could snap out the view and replace it with a unit test. So we can actually run tests, automated tests on the view model, because the view is only a container of the UI elements that we need. And the view model will have all the presentation logic. So if we have enough time, I'll show you really quick how something like unit testing on the view model works. Otherwise, I will have a sample available on GitHub which will have a unit test as well. So another interesting thing is, why did we develop this framework? Well, WinForms was before MVVM basically, so WinForms wasn't designed for MVVM. A couple of years after WinForms was released, Microsoft started on WPF, and that has all the MVVM principles on board. So WinForms just doesn't have a couple of things, and that is all being done through our framework. So there are some complicated aspects like services and behaviors, and they work pretty neat out of the box, so you don't need to do a lot for that. While in other scenarios, if you wouldn't have this framework and you wanted to go on WinForms and MVVM, you have to do quite some work for that. Well, and this will obviously reduce the amount of code that you have in your view models, which results in cleaner view models and better maintainability. And then we have some awesome design time support to set up the bindings, the commands, and all the nice things that come with MVVM. And I'll show how that works slightly later on. So let's get started. And I have already set up an empty project for this. So let me switch over to Visual Studio. And what I did here, to save a bit of time, because we're going to need the time anyway, I have set up an empty project with the DevExpress template gallery. So that would basically be, if you go to new project, you'll have the DevExpress template gallery, and I set up an empty WinForms application. The only thing I basically did was I renamed form 1 to main form, and that's about it. And the other thing is I created a folder called data, and I'm going to drag in 2 files there. I'll explain because I will be using some in-memory data for this. I'm going to drag them in right now. One of them is a class which is track info. It will hold some music tracks with some composers, some other information here. And the other one is a track list. So that is basically a collection. And I took some data out of the Chinook database, which you can find at Codeplex. It holds a whole bunch of songs in there, and we're going to work with this data. So let me start with one of the very nice features that we have. You should remember, if you're using this framework, you should rebuild some things now and then, because otherwise the design time features won't work entirely, or they won't find things. So I've built it, and well, the main form was empty. I'm going to right click, and I will go to add a DevExpress item. In this case, I will go to the WinForms section, and you will see a WinForms MVVM section here. So if I now click the view and view model, I will first create a view with a view model which allows us to edit the details of one of those tracks. So I will call the view track view, and you see that automatically a view model class is being created, which will have the name track view model. I will be using the Pogo view model instead of the regular view model. The Pogo view model is Pogo stands for plain old CLR object, and that means that the view model class is not derived from any base class that we provide as well. If you want to use certain functionality, you could go for a regular view model, but in this case I'll go for the plain one. And this is particularly interesting if you want to put some MVVM logic in an existing application, because you're not depending on anything. Well, as I mentioned, I'm going to do a quick build here, and let me close a couple of files. And in this case, I will have a couple of files being added. One of them is the view, which is the track view, and the other one is the track view model. So let me take a look at the track view class first. And this is basically a simple user control. In the case of our creation, it will be a DevExpress user control. So if I view the code here, you'll see that we have an extra user control, and the benefit by using this one is, for instance, if you want to use theming, this will work pretty well out of the box when using this kind of user control. But this is not the most important one. The other one that we have here is a track view model. And this is, as you can see, decorated with the Pogo view model attribute. And this is something which comes with the DevExpress MVVM library. Just here. The framework is a convention-based framework that we provide. And that means that if you follow certain rules, with particularly on names, for instance, and the scope of certain methods or properties, then you'll find most use of the framework because it will do quite a bit of things for you without you even have to worry about it. And one of the conventions is that you should hide a constructor and that you should use a factory class which will generate an instance of this view model. Well, I'm gonna deal with the track info. So let me first show you quickly that there were like a couple of properties in there, but I'm not gonna deal with all of them. There is a track ID, a name, there is even an album ID, a couple of other things. I will just be dealing with the track ID, the name and the composer. So if I go back to the track view model, I will set up a couple of things here really quick. And that is, don't be scared of the amount of code, I'll explain it. I have a private member track. That will be the track that we will be editing. And next I have a couple of properties, and this is one of the conventions that we have. If you want to expose certain data entities to the view, you have to make that a public virtual property. And the reason that we have to make that virtual is that at runtime we will create a descendant class of this particular view model class and we'll put a lot of functionality in there for you. And you'll see that a bit later how that works, but that is why it is really important to have it as a public virtual property so we can override that property and change the behavior basically. For the rest, I've put a couple of helper methods here, not really exciting. It's a store one, it will copy the property values back into that object that we're dealing with, and the load one will load the properties of the view model with the properties of the track object that we pass in. So that is the first step that we do. I was mentioning about hiding the constructor because we don't want to have this view model being created or instantiated at runtime by using its constructor. So the most easy way of doing that is by creating a protected constructor like this. And in this case we have, you're unable to instantiate it by code. I will pass in one of the tracks here, which happens to be my favorite song, but you'll see in a minute what it is. And I was mentioning this class should be instantiated by a factory. And the factory is something which comes with the framework. And the way that this works is that we have to create a static create method, which will use the factory to instantiate a new track view model. And this basically works like we create the static track view model, we use the factory class which receives a lambda expression which instantiates a new instance of this track view model. So this is like a bit of a standard approach when setting up new view models. So, and with this in place we can actually do a quick build. And we can take a look at the design time features of the MVVM framework, and we can see how we can actually bind UI elements to specific properties or behavior of this view model. So I go back to the track view user control here. Let me make it a bit bigger. And what we see here is there is one control or component added to this control, and that is an MVVM Context component. And this is actually one of the control components that is the core of the whole MVVM for WinForms. This thing will keep track of bindings, it will keep track of services, behaviors and messages. It will bind this particular track view model, in this case to this view, etc. So this is basically, it knows what's going on at this stage. And we can use design time features as well as some coding features, and you'll see that a bit later how we can approach that. So for now there is not much to do because we have to drop a couple of elements on there. So let me quickly go here, and in the DevExpress controls we have a text edit. Make it a bit bigger, And well, we could have a another edit as well, like this. And let me also see if we have a couple of labels. Well, you know what, doesn't matter really a lot. I am going to rename the properties a bit because otherwise I don't know what's going on here. So this will be the ID, and this will be the name, and this will be the composer, just like this. Well, and we've got some UI set up, so now we can activate the action, the task menu of this MVVM Context component, and we can actually say edit the bindings and the commands. Well, what we can do now is we can have properties that were exposed by the view model, for instance the track ID, and we can bind that to one of the UI elements on the form. And in this case it will be the text edit, and I want to bind it to the edit value of the member. I'll do the same for the name. Again, I'm going to bind it to the edit value, and I'm going to pick the composer, and that would be the other one. I'm going to bind that one also to the edit value, but in this case of the text edit composer. Well, and with this in place, let me quickly build it. I can now drag this user control on my main form, so if I scroll all the way up here I can get it. And because we're dealing with an inline or an in-memory data store in this case, you see that it actually works design time. Well, if we now run the application, we have basically our first MVVM application. But yeah, this is obviously not really exciting because you could do this more or less with WinForms as well. But let's take it a step further and put some logic in there. So if I go back to the track view, I will put a button right behind the name. And let me give that the text clear name. Like this. I will also rename that button to button clear, just like this. And well, what I basically want is two things. If I hit that button, the name field should be cleared. But also, if that text control is already empty, that button can be disabled. So I've got two things that I want to do. And okay, I hear you think, okay, I can do an on-click event and I can clear that box, and then I can check that box to see if it's empty and change the state with a couple of events. But that is something that we just don't want to do right now because we're thinking in MVVM terms. So let's go back to the view model to code some logic in there. Here is the view model, and what I will do first is I will create a method which I will call reset name. And this is one of the things which also comes with the convention-based framework that I was talking about. I am creating a public method with a name, reset name in this case. And what it does, it will clear the property on the view model. So we don't have anything to do with editors or values or I don't know, whatever. We're just clearing this property because that's what it does. And then I want to do another thing, and that was I want to change the disabled state and the enabled state of that button. So what I can do next is I can implement another method which returns a Boolean, and this is also an important aspect of the convention-based framework I was mentioning. This is a Boolean method which starts with can, and it holds the same name as the method that you saw before. So by name and by signature, they are more or less connected to each other. When can we reset the name? When the name property is not empty. That is basically the constraint that we're putting on there. So let's do a quick build and get back to the view. And what we can do now is, if I go back to the MVVM Context task menu, I can now go to Edit Bindings and Commands again. And what you see here is that we have a command, you can see that on the different icon here, which says reset name. It doesn't say anything about can reset name. I can now attach that command, because this is an MVVM term, like I'm attaching this command to the button clear. And with this in place, I have almost set it up in a way that it works as I explained earlier, because there is one thing that we also need to do there. It needs to be triggered whenever that property changes in the view model. So for that, and again, this is also like name based. If I put in a method which starts with on, ends with changed, and the name corresponds with a property name here, that also will be some kind of connected at runtime, and it will make sure that everything fires up nicely. So with these small modifications, I can now run the application again, and let me drag it on the screen that I'm presenting on. So now the clear name is possible. If I hit it, you'll see that the name box has been cleared and the box has been disabled. And if I start typing again, you'll see that the clear name enables automatically. So I didn't check anything on editors and stuff. I was just checking data in the view model, and I've been doing the logic in the view model. So this is probably a bit more interesting. But let's make it a bit more interesting, because I want to have a confirmation. I want to have, if I hit that button, I want to have a confirmation like, are you sure you want to delete that name? So for that, we're going to introduce another aspect of the MVVM pattern, and that is a so-called service. Because, I mean, we could like pop something up here which shows a dialog or something, but that would be cool, because then we are dealing directly with the UI, and that is something that we don't want in the view model. So for that, we're going to introduce a service, and the MVVM framework comes with a whole bunch of services for all kinds of purposes, and the most easy way to implement that behavior is by just setting up a protected virtual, in this case an iMessageBox service, and you don't even need to return anything, because we will change this behavior at runtime. That's why we make it virtual. And with this in place, you might notice this attribute with the service property, and this determines whether, whenever this MessageBox service is invoked somewhere, if it should search for an existing service that was already on a parent form or something in this case. But there are a couple of other parameters as well, but this is pretty well explained in the documentation. So we have this MessageBox service here, and what I can do now is I can just use the MessageBox service with a method which probably looks pretty familiar parameter wise, and I can now use the MessageBox service to show that message, are you sure? And if that's yes, we're going to do it. Well, then we also need to tell the view that we want to use that service, and for that we can invoke the action list again, and I will go to Edit Services. And here we have a whole bunch of different services for all kinds of purposes, but I will keep it down to the MessageBox service that we were dealing with. A bit later I'll use another service as well, but that comes later. And with this in place, we have the actual implementation of that MessageBox defined on the view instead of the view model. So when I hit the the application run button again, and I drag the screen to here. If I now hit that clear name, you will get that confirmation. Are you sure you want to reset? If I say yes, it's gone. If I hit no, it's not gone. So this is one of the more interesting features, I guess, because you'll see that there is no UI related things going on in that view model. Still, it has all the logic and all the presentation logic coded in the view model. And that's the interesting part about the whole MVVM design pattern. So we have done this one little thing now, but let's set up another view with another view model which will show a list of tracks. So you'll see what tracks that we have, and then if we double click on one of the grid cells, it should open up this particular view, which allows us to change it. So to do so, I can go to the DevExpress item, add a new item, and let me add another view and view model. In this case, this will be the track list view, and this will be changed in Tracklist View Model. Do a quick build here, and I'm going to implement some things which I already done for the other one, so I'll skip over that pretty quickly. If I go to the ListView Model, I will add the following code. What I've done, I have created a public virtual property which holds the tracks collection. I have also created the selected track one, but we'll get to that slightly later. I have hidden the constructor, and again I have created the static create method. Well, what we need to do now, or what we actually can do now, is if I build this again, I can go back to the tracklist view, make it slightly bigger, and let's look up one of our grid controls. So let me quickly look that up. I'm going to use this one. Let me dock that one to its maximum size, like this. And with this in place, well, I need to bind a data source. I will not be using this one, but I will be using the MVVM Context one instead. So I'll go to bindings and commands. You already see there are two properties, but I will be needing the tracks collection. Obviously, the selected track is something else, is one entity. And I can now take the target, which will be the grid control, and I will bind it to its data source. So if I now go back to the main form, remove this one, I can drag the other one on. So here we are, and well, let me make the form a bit wider, and then we can probably make that bigger as well, but it doesn't matter so much. So you already see the whole list of tracks that we have, and by running the application you'll see that we'll just have the collection of tracks here, just like this. But now we're going to do a couple of things, and that is also pretty interesting, because what we want to do is, if I double click any of those rows, I want this other view to show, and it should synchronize the data, so it should hand over the selected item basically. There are a couple of things which are worth mentioning, because one of the things is that the double click event doesn't exist on this control, on this grid, so we need to do something with that, and that is where the selected track comes in. The other thing is that we need to have the selected track before we can hand it over. So we can solve that by using the MVVM context, but we're going to do that slightly different because I'm going to use a bit of code, and that would basically be the only code which is inside the Tracklist View. So if I go here, we have the initialize component method, and by the way, if we check out the track view code, that's nice to mention as well, it doesn't have any code and still it has all that functionality. So that is MVVM. So let's get back to the Tracklist View and to the code, and I will put a bit of code in here and I'll explain what it does. So I will put in the following. I'll put in a method which I've called Init bindings, and what this basically does is it will access the MVVM context directly, and this is a generic method. And what we want to do is that whenever the focused row changed, I want to fire something which is on the view model, and that is being done with an event to command converter method, which comes with the MVVM context control. And in this case, what I'll do, I will have the focused row object changed event on the grid view, and whenever that happens, I'm going to bind something. I'm going to do a binding action on the view model, which makes sure that my selected track will be updated with the current object of the current row, basically. These arguments are coming. If you're familiar with WinForms controls, then you'll know that we have the arguments on this focus row object changed. They will be passed over here, and we will bind basically this event to a command on the view model. Well, another thing that I mentioned was that there is not really a double click event on that grid. So what are we going to do? How are we going to do the double click event? Well, for that we're going to do a bit of extra code here as well. In this case, we're going to do another event, which is the row click event args. And in this particular case, we can actually count the number of clicks. In this case, a double click is 2 clicks, and it should happen on the left button, so we can actually simulate the double click basically on the grid. And in that case, there is a method on the view model, which is the edit track, which I didn't implement yet, to be fired. So this is one of the, that we call this the fluent API of the MVVM context component, because as you can see, you can just chain up those events here, which makes things a bit shorter. But well, it was giving me this edit track that was not found, so let's get back to the Tracklist View model and implement that. Well, before we will implement that, we need to invoke another service. So let me implement that service, and this is going to be a document manager service. And this is basically the pop-up which will hold the other view. We call this a document, so that's why we call it a document manager service. And the edit method will basically get that track object, we will cast it over, and we will invoke the document manager service to create a document which holds the track view. Furthermore, we'll pass in that view model which is based on the track. Well, what we see here is that the create method of the track view model has no parameters at all as I set it up, this static create method. So we need to add some code in that view model as well, and that is why I prepared a couple of things already. What I can do now is, if I comment out this line, because we're going to optimize it slightly, I will create a new protected constructor which receives one parameter, and I have optimized this code to this one. So it will basically do the same, but it will use the overload. And then I'm going to create a second static method which will receive one parameter. So you can actually set a number of those static create methods. And with this in place, if I go back to the Tracklist View model, you'll see that it has been resolved and that we should be able to build this. But before we build this, let me go back to the Tracklist View and expose that service that we were going to use. So that is being done by the document manager service, like this. And if we would now run the application, there is an error. Well, let me see what is going on there. Yeah, there are a couple of things that I should. There's one other thing that I should change before we continue, and that is because we are invoking that track view by using the document service, there are a couple of events which happen slightly in a different order that we don't want. So what we're going to do is we're going to bind the properties and the commands that we did on the track view by code. So instead of doing it here, I will remove all of them and I will do it by code. And again, this is also to show how you can achieve that. So if I go to the code of this particular one, I will put in the similar approach as I already did. So this is going to be the init bindings method. I'm going to get that instance of the context, in this case of the track view model, because this is another model. And this is basically how you set up the bindings by code. So this is basically what we did in the designer, but now I'm going to bind the edit value of the control to the property of the view model. And I set up a couple of commands as well, and let's make it a bit more interesting by switching back to the designer. Let me see, where was it again? I'm going to put a couple of extra buttons on there, and that is basically I wanted to have the normal ones, the DevExpress ones. So I'm going to put up two buttons. One of them will be save. And let me get a good idea as well. So that's going to be save and button cancel. And what these should basically do is if I hit save, the collection will be updated where the grid was bound to. And if I hit cancel, the original value should be restored in the editors. And I can now also go to the code and perform the command bindings like this. Well, as you can see, I didn't put up those methods yet. And to make that really easy, I will implement a couple of things on the view. On the view model. What I do is I will implement a standard interface which comes with the .NET framework, which is the iEditable object, and this is just to make things a bit simpler. So it's going to look like this, and if I implement this, I need to implement this explicitly. If I don't implement this explicitly, you'll see that we have all those methods as commands, and we probably don't want to do that. So I'm going to implement it explicitly. So the methods are hidden from the view. And what I can do here is if I remove these lines of code. The begin edit doesn't do a lot. I can say at the end edit I can do save. The store method, and the cancel one will be the cancel one, will be the load. I will just reload the original values here from the object that we were dealing with. And well, now I can just hit create a command which is save, and I can do a command which is called revert. And if we now get back to that view, you'll see that those commands are already bound to those buttons. So with this in place, I should add one extra thing here, because the init bindings is not being executed right now. I will execute the init bindings, and I do run a simple check if not design mode. And I should do that at the other one as well, by the way. So I can just do it like this. And I need to do this obviously on the grid view as well. So let me put that here. So yeah, with this in place, I have like a really small application. Let me run that. And what we have here is the grid again. If I now double click this one, it will go into edit mode. So let me go back to the grid view and disable editing, because that is something that will interfere with the double click action. So here is the designer, and I can now in the feature browser disable the edit version like this. If I now double click, you'll see that we have access to this particular object. If I change this, you'll see that nothing is being stored back. If I hit save, you'll see that it stays. So yeah, with this in place, we have a very simple setup which demonstrates how you can separate the UI from the presentation logic. And obviously it goes way further than that. I mean, there are navigation features, there are all kinds of features here. And we obviously have some pretty powerful scaffolding wizards which allow you to connect to a database and create all the views automatically for you.
Perfect. So if you want to contact Don, he just put up all of his contact details, donw@devexpress.com. You can find him on Twitter as well at Don Wibier. All right, everybody. Like I mentioned before, today's webinar will be available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I posted the link in the chat box. And you can check out devexpress.com/webinars for any upcoming sessions and to watch previously recorded webinars as well. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Don. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.